sunshine. Welcome again to another I Spy in July video. I'm really happy to finally be doing this. I wanted to do something like this video for a while now since I released my book Kidnapped Entanglement. So just really quickly, so you get an idea of what the book's about, a kidnapping gone wrong, and these two women have to now escape while their family back home negotiating for their release and trying to give the bad guys what they really want, because it's not just as simple as money. But I am going to be reading chapter 1 in this video for you from my book, so you get to hear it, not just read it. And if you wanted to start the adventure, it starts off with the kidnapping, so it's exciting stuff to start with, so I hope you enjoy it. I was going to film myself reading it, but decided instead to use the beginning of what I had started to record for the audiobook. I only ended up, I think, with 4 chapters recorded, and I haven't had time and money to go back and continue recording the audiobook, but this is the first glimpse that you'll get into it. I hope you enjoy this little glimpse into my very first novel, a Christian suspense of Kidnapped Entanglement.
Jazz slammed on her brakes, ignoring the honking of lunchtime commuters. Screams echoed through the street. A scene at the parking lot to her right was drawing cautious eyes as a blonde woman struggled against a man in surgical gloves and a grey suit. His bald head gleamed and his muscles threatened to tear through his clothes. The woman's cries pierced the air again, and another man in gloves appeared behind the two as they struggled. He slid open the side door of a white van, motioning for Muscles to hurry. Shorter than the other man, this one had black hair that hung in raggedy strips just under his ears, and what appeared to be a permanent snarl. Jazz changed course and pulled up as close to the van as she dared. She slammed into park and yanked open her door. Leaving the keys in the ignition, Jazz launched out of the car and sprinted forward. "Hey!" she screamed, pushing through the deafening pulse of her heartbeat. The movement startled Muscles, and he glanced in the direction of the shout. The distraction loosened his grip on the flailing woman, and she pushed out of his arms. Jazz scanned the area, but with nobody else in sight, she allowed a curse to escape as she checked for the proximity of the other assailant. These men were strong. Hopefully her years of self-defense drills would flood her muscle memory if it came to that. Use their strength against them and your agility as an advantage. She'd heard that advice over and over. Muscles quickly reached out for the blonde woman again, regaining his hold. He pushed her closer to the open van, but the resolve in her thin frame wasn't giving in so easily. The second man's position was revealed as hands pulled Jazz's waist backwards with a sharp tug. Air was pushed out of her lungs and she gasped for breath as she bucked against the man's body. Brown curls splayed over her face, but she was unable to push them away as the two continued in their own struggle. She shifted her weight, but she wasn't in an optimal position to break his hold. With her arms pinned at her sides, he continued to crush her body tighter. Sweat pooled behind her on her camouflage pattern t-shirt as the heat mixed with adrenaline, spreading through her body and down to her fingertips. Jazz flicked her legs in all directions, attempting to shift them off balance. A hard metal object thumped against her waist as she struggled. He had a weapon. As she was pulled further, fear replaced the surge of adrenaline. With her shift, he took advantage and they leveled off in time for Jazz to watch helplessly as a rag was shoved over the blonde woman's face. She had failed. She'd been too late and too weak to help her. The woman's body started to droop and a hissing behind Jazz filled her left ear. "John, not too much. You're going to kill her." John waited for the woman to drop both arms, then pulled the cloth away from her. "I know what I'm doing, Wyatt. Just deal with that one." He motioned towards Jazz as he lifted the unconscious blonde woman into the open space of the van. As her own body was lifted off the ground, urgency flooded her veins. She rolled to the side, trying to break loose. She had to get that woman out of the van. To her disappointment, nobody else had jumped into the fray yet. Jazz tried to run through the possible ways to slip out of Wyatt's hold, but after neglecting training for so long, her options were coming to mind too slowly. He dragged her towards the van, where John was opening the driver's door. As he glanced back at their entangled bodies, he slammed the door, muttering to himself. With steady breath still eluding her, the sounds around Jazz were starting to fade. Another thump against her back of Wyatt's weapon gave her an idea. She twisted and attempted to reach behind and grip the gun. The end of Wyatt's suit jacket collected in her palm instead, and she pulled down hard. He buckled with a string of curse words, then released an arm from around her waist to stabilize himself. Jazz fought the dizziness and pulled around enough to face him. His arm still clutched her, but she used the opportunity to reach out with an open palm. It cracked against Wyatt's cheek and he recoiled. Ignoring John's advance to her left, Jazz reached back for another hit. Wyatt swiveled and ducked the blow, regaining his grip around her and pulling her backwards. This time, Jazz had her arms outside his hold, and she flung herself backwards, grabbing a handful of Wyatt's hair. When she yanked forward, his head slammed into her back, and they both yelled out at the impact. Before she could recover, something hard smashed her skull. She inhaled sharply and tried to see the men through increasingly blurred vision. John stood beside her, his gun hanging in his right hand. Lifted off the ground, she was thrown into the waiting van, and the dizziness turned violently into nausea. As the colourful blurs finally morphed into sharper focus, Wyatt's snarling face shoved the gun between her eyes. "You should have minded your own business. Now you'll pay the same price as her." He motioned to the blonde stranger behind her, his lips twisted into a cruel smile as he slapped her hard across the face. Wyatt bent to the ground and raised the same rag they had used on the other woman. He took a final step towards her, crushing a small Bluetooth headset under his loafers. Wyatt pushed the rag over her face and she tried to yell, but it was too late. A sweet smell filled her nose and she tried not to breathe in too deeply. Damn, chloroform. Her efforts to not inhale the soaked rag failed, and she drifted into a drug-induced blackout. Scattered memories raced through her mind as she fought to come out of the haze. John's face, being lifted up, being slammed down, disappearing into the darkness again. Things sounded quiet as the drug's effects faded. She crashed back to reality as her entire body slammed into a hard surface. With a small groan, she opened her eyes and waited to adjust to the darkness. Once the outlines of her claustrophobic surroundings became more distinguishable, she tried to fight the confusion. The dull throbbing in the back of her head distracted her until another movement flung her body to the right. She hit what felt like carpeted wall, and a distant car horn jolted her memory. Forgetting her new prison, she tried to sit up and groaned as her forehead bumped into the roof. She had been taken. Jazz rubbed her head and tried to slow her breathing. She had to think. The last thing she remembered was a woman, a white van, and two mysterious men. Glancing around her, it was clear that she wasn't in the van anymore. She was in a car boot. We switched cars? It wasn't too bad for space. She could still maneuver easily from side to side. Jazz felt around underneath her. Maybe she could find something to use against them when they opened the door. But the floor was empty. She exhaled, her hot breath pushing a stray curl out of her eyes. Twisting, Jazz fumbled to find the latch that would click the boot open from the inside. The metal frame refused to reveal the spot, but she continued to run her fingers over the entire length of it. With a groan, she finally withdrew her hands and slammed a fist onto the roof above her. The car was too old to have the release latch inside. What now? She couldn't let those brutes have the upper hand when they finally lifted the lid of this hot box. The space was growing smaller and hotter with every breath. A new idea revealed itself, and she pushed against the back seat of the rear interior. With no movement, she resorted to banging her fists against the seat. When that also failed, Jazz stopped and took slow breaths, considering her options carefully. She couldn't afford to be taken, not now. She had too much at stake. The blonde woman. Jazz hoped they hadn't been separated and that she was in the back seat and not subjected to another car boot. At least if they were together, they'd have the benefit of numbers for an escape or negotiation. Another movement of the car thrust her against a metal edge of the frame. She yelled at the impact to her already injured head. Tingles began to spread through her left leg. Pins and needles were the last thing that she needed. Kicking her foot against the other end of the boot, Jazz closed her eyes, pinching her nose and waiting for the sensation to subside. Where's my phone? Jazz quickly checked her pockets, but she'd left it in her car when she had jumped out. Her keys, phone and handbag were all sitting in her green Mitsubishi. The police would hopefully be searching the scene by now, and those things would allow them to identify her. When they found out who she was, they'd do whatever they could to get her back. The brief moment of comfort was short-lived as the car swerved again. She braced herself until they shifted back into a normal rhythm. Her body was beginning to ache, and she shuffled onto her side, regrouping. Jazz scanned every edge, line, and crevice in the space. The top corner held a small, hollowed-out section with another kind of latch leading to the tail light. Adjusting her arms, Jazz reached forward. She just needed to pop out the tail light and make a signal for passing cars. She tried pushing the latch. When it didn't budge, she rotated herself and slammed her foot against the similar space on the other side. With no success, she wiped her forehead and spread the sweat from her forehead on her jeans. Thanks to the dark interior, Jazz couldn't tell how long she'd been unconscious, or how many kilometres they'd travelled. The police would search a fair distance, but if they'd been moved out too far, it would be harder to find them. Chloroform rags, a van that could get lost in traffic, and another car to transfer to. It was too methodical, and that made her nervous. With her elbows planted, Jazz raised her body and tried to see something through the small cracks in the frame. Another turn flung her backwards. She pounded against all sides of the carpeted walls, screaming out her frustration. When her rage had been released, she focused on counting 3 seconds for each breath and waited for her pulse to reduce. She needed a plan, not a pity party. All those years of drills, training, and unpleasant adventures with her father had prepared her for this. She just had to remember it all. God, I'm going to need your help. Jazz braced herself against another sharp right turn as the car slammed to a stop. She grumbled as she was thrown against the walls for the final time, then yelled something nonsensical. The rumble of the engine stopped, and she tensed. She had to be ready. Balling up her fists, she prepared herself for a fight. If they were going to pull her out of this boot, they'd do it with her feet kicking and arms swinging. Muffled sounds came from all sides. Car doors opened and closed. The voices grew clearer as they approached, and the rusted boot lid creaked open. Moonlight hit her face as the world reappeared. She threw her leg in Wyatt's direction, but he dodged the blow. With John's help, they swiftly reached down and took hold of her, one at her shoulders, the other gripping her feet, lifting her out of the boot. She'd lost the element of surprise, and they were quickly regaining control. Jazz screamed for help, swinging her arms wildly. As her eyes adjusted further to the dim lighting, the 2 men dropped her onto the ground, the impact shattering through her back. John towered over her, with his gun aimed to discourage escape. A quick glance around confirmed her fears. They were in the middle of nowhere. The road was a dusty gravel strip. Beside it sat trees and low-lying plants that obscured the path to freedom on all sides. There was no sign of civilization out here, so her cries had been worthless. Wyatt pulled out a plastic zip tie from his suit jacket, and Jazz, still reeling from the radiating pain, complied as he pushed her from her back onto her stomach to secure the restraints. Radio static echoed, then voices confirmed that Alpha Team had arrived back at home base with an additional package. Wyatt pulled the zip tie hard against her wrists, and Jazz grunted as it burrowed into her skin. 3 men dressed in black t-shirts and pants approached them. She was outnumbered. As she was flipped to her side, it gave her a better view of the automatic weapons that each of the 3 new men held. "Do anything stupid," Wyatt said, "and one of us will blow your stupid brains all over the floor." She glanced over at John, his face displaying a disapproving scowl. When he shifted his attention back to her, he replaced the scowl with a stoic expression. Behind her, one of the other men pulled Jazz to her feet. With her hands now behind her back, she struggled to catch her balance. The new guys seemed an odd mix. One was a short Hispanic man with a solid build of muscles that, much like John, was a single movement away from tearing through his t-shirt. "You couldn't just wear clothes that fit?" The second man opened a rear door of the car that Jazz had been pulled from. His blonde, wavy hair reminded her of a surfer, but the laid-back attitude that usually went with it was replaced with constant irritation. The final man finished propping Jazz up and pushed her forward. She stumbled, but managed to find the right balance. She'd noticed his balding dark hair when they'd first approached. He looked older than the others. If she was guessing, she'd put him at around 60, too old for this kind of work. The surfer stepped back from the car, pulling out the unconscious blonde woman. Her arms and legs sagged lifelessly as she was transferred to John. He tossed her over his shoulder, letting her body fall down his back. He started walking, unconcerned about her arms hanging inches from the ground. Maybe Wyatt had been right when John had used the chloroform earlier. Maybe he'd used too much. As they were led away from the car, Jazz finally noticed that the older model sedan appeared to be an old taxi. The crude identifying markings, however, were rapidly peeling and displaying the shoddy paint job underneath. They hadn't been prepared for Jazz, hence the boot treatment after they'd ditched the white van. She was fortunate that they had decided to keep her alive, for now. The woman in front of her looked much the same as before, except for a lack of jewellery. Her grey suede heels hung loosely on her feet. The Hispanic hunk was dragging what appeared to be her white handbag with one hand and balancing his machine gun in the other. Jazz couldn't see the woman's face clearly. If she was the target of a kidnapping, she must be someone important. Hopefully, they wouldn't be separated, and the two could coordinate a plan. Wyatt's gun stabbed at Jazz between her shoulder blades as they walked along the gravel road. The sounds of night insects gave the otherwise quiet area an eerie feeling. No streetlights illuminated the path. The surfer had apparently been designated as the torchbearer when they had abandoned the headlights of the car. After a few minutes, another light source illuminated the outline of a large, confined property. The fences surrounding it were of tall, solid wood that looked new. An iron gate sat in the middle with a small check-in point. The portable room looked like it would fit 2 people, but at this time of night it held only 1 with heavy firepower. 2 floodlights on either side of the gate flicked on. Trying to watch the exchange between the old man and the gatekeeper, Jazz squinted against the restricted lighting. After a hushed conversation, the large gate swung backwards and Wyatt shoved his gun harder into her back. Jazz took the cue and moved forward, having found a rhythm as she walked with her hands awkwardly situated behind her back. As they made their way through the property, Jazz began creating a mental picture. Inside the fence, lights were set up all around, giving her a full view of the options for escape. A run-down house sat at the far back, with empty space spreading out on either side. Even from here, Jazz could see the roof sagging and the wooden slats that layered over each other on the outside frame. Most likely, they were beginning to succumb to a termite invasion. The solid fence ran around the expansive area, and men with heavy artillery were stationed at several points, patrolling. To one side, an automatic garage door began to close on several SUVs. This was not an ordinary, neglected house. The alterations made it clear that it was a fortress they marched towards in silence. Jazz shifted her focus to the surrounding area. A space at the back corner of the property caught her eye. She tried not to stare for too long, where she had spotted a small gap in the fence, leading to dark, dense shrubbery on the other side, and it wasn't being paid much attention. That could be their path to freedom. God, I need your guidance and courage. This is beyond what I can do on my own. A shove from behind propelled Jazz forward as they approached the front door. Now, closer to her new home, she noticed bars on the outside of the windows. The front porch held a rocking chair with cobwebs and dust over every inch. The front door slammed open and 4 additional men with guns exited. They waited as a man with long, slicked-back hair appeared in the doorway. Jazz was hoping that the greasy film that covered his head was gel, not sweat. The heat had cooled in the night hours, but she still felt a warm breeze carrying scents that wafted from inside the house. The man at the door scowled, crossing his arms over his chest and jutting his chin upwards. "Wyatt, why am I not surprised you couldn't manage a simple grab without—" He eyed Jazz up and down. "Complications." To her right, Jazz heard a quiet snort of satisfaction from John before he pushed through the crowd towards the front of the men, the woman still dangling from his back. The boss checked on her, then leaned closer to Jazz with a chilling smile. He lowered his voice. "You should have stayed out of this." He straightened and eyed his men, then gave a short flick of his hand. They moved into the crumbling structure. After making their way through the front lounge, Jazz was turned left into a long hallway. Although the walls were stained from years of neglect and discoloured graffiti lined each one, they were concrete and holding up pretty well. Cameras were hung in the corners above them, swivelling in a rhythmic pattern. They were going to be a problem. 1, 2, 3, 4. Jazz counted the doors down the hallway as they passed. All remained closed, with no clue to what was behind them. She tried taking small breaths through her mouth as the smell of cigarettes and body odour grew more pungent. The scent wasn't unexpected, but the strength of it took her breath away as they continued further into her new prison. The zip ties were cutting deeper through her skin with every step. She knew that once they were removed, a deep red crevice would remain on each wrist. Jazz watched the woman swing from side to side on John's back as they moved around the corner and into another hallway. She clicked another mental picture of the house's layout. 1, 2, 3. At the final wall of the house, the hunk unlocked a heavily secured door, pushing it open and revealing a short set of steps below. The hunk stepped aside for John, who moved down them carefully. With Wyatt's gun prodding her, Jazz shuffled down the stairs, her arms still behind her. The base of the stairs was just big enough for the four to squeeze into. The concrete walls had deep cracks. In front of them, a large metal door reached from floor to ceiling. It was rusted along the hinges and held 3 mysterious hatches, one at the top, one in the middle, and one at the bottom. Wyatt pushed his way in front of John and ignored the glare, smiling and sliding his key into the locks. Jazz checked behind her, but with the surfer standing at the top of the steps, escape was impossible. The large door was pulled open, swallowing the room in a strained, creaking, metallic sound. John lowered the blonde woman onto an old, stained mattress. Now behind her, the surfer shoved Jazz into the room. She stumbled, but managed to keep herself upright. John's focus remained on Wyatt instead of their prisoner. Curious. Wyatt reached into a shoulder holster and pulled out a Glock 17. "Here's the deal, Toots. We have a man stationed outside this door at all times. Whenever you're taken to the pisser or anywhere else that you're told, those little ties will accompany you." He motioned to her hands with the gun. They were still aching, but the idea of the restraints being removed produced a wash of relief. "When we close this door, that hatch in the middle is going to open. If you want the ties to come off, you'll put your hands through it." "So I get to trust that you won't cut off a finger?" Jazz asked, feeling bold. Wyatt smiled through gritted teeth. "Unless you want to leave them on." Jazz shook her head, not exasperating her captors further. "No." Wyatt and John almost collided as they attempted to leave at the same time. John managed to sidestep and slipped through first, despite his larger frame. Wyatt grumbled under his breath as he slammed the door behind him. As she was left alone, a violent shake vibrated through Jazz's body. The hatch in the middle of the door slid open with a metal zing. "Hands!" Wyatt commanded from the other side. She breathed deeply to boost her courage. There was no guarantee that her hands would come back in one piece. She had no choice but to trust his word. Quickly, she maneuvered them through the slot, squeezing her eyes and holding her breath. A blade snapped against the zip ties and her eyes flicked open. Wyatt shoved her hands back through the hatch and crashed it shut. The lock clunked into place and muffled voices began to disappear. Jazz did a quick scan of the small basement, ending with the woman who was still unconscious on the mattress. Turning back to the door, she inspected the possibilities of a breakout. Unfortunately, no handles sat on this side. The door ran from floor to ceiling with a small crack that let air slip through the bottom. "Toots, what is this, the 1930s? Jazz mumbled to herself as she turned to check on the woman. John had taken care when he'd put her down, and she looked almost peaceful. Their bedding was severely worn, with stains surrounding most of the surface. Jazz checked for a pulse. Satisfied it was strong enough, she pulled a folded blanket from the edge of the bed across the woman. There was something familiar about her face. After a minute, she gave up searching her mind and flipped her hand in the air. Jazz looked down at her watch. She had had this thing for over 10 years, but it was still ticking. It was 2 a.m. She sat on the floor beside the mattress and closed her eyes with a long breath. Reaching underneath the top of her t-shirt, she was glad to find the locket that hung around her neck every day still in place. The other woman hadn't been as fortunate. It might be a bit of a shock when she discovered her own jewelry missing. The small silver locket that Jazz's grandmother had left her had always been a comfort in difficult situations. She held it between her fingers, twirling the chain until it tangled together. Her mind drifted to the people she cared about, and she dropped the locket. Opening her tear-stung eyes, Jazz allowed the weight of her new status to crash over her. She needed to accept it and grieve for her situation. Then she'd push it aside and focus on their task ahead, their escape. A hanging light was suspended at the top of the high ceiling. She wondered if she should turn it off, even for a fitful night of sleep. A faint engine rumble drew her towards the far wall. She pushed her ear against it and held her breath. If her mind map of the estate was correct, the 4-car garage sat beyond this wall. The creak of the automatic door slowly whirred, then the engines grew silent once again. Why are they leaving so late? Changing shifts? Jazz pushed that aside for now and surveyed the tools at their disposal. The room was small and sparse, and the mattress, a green plastic chair, and the blanket were all that their hosts had provided. A small barred window sat at the top of the west wall. Why have bars on the window if we can't reach it? Her attempt at a chuckle fell flat in the silent room as she sighed, staring up at the ceiling. Noticing the hanging light again, she looked for the switch. She shook her head at the blank walls and slowly walked the length of the room, dragging her hand across the concrete. Not even a light switch. Jazz rolled her eyes. This crew was professional. It wasn't going to be easy to escape, but if they didn't... She allowed the thought to linger only for a moment. The light flickered, then evaporated as the guard flipped it off. She was alone in the darkness. Sighing, Jazz settled into the singular chair, trying to get as comfortable as she could. God, Jazz began a prayer. She didn't try to hide the desperation in her voice, not in front of her Heavenly Father. Help me escape. She looked back to the woman as a tear cascaded down her cheek. Help us survive.
Well, that's all you get, I'm afraid, here and now. But if you wanted to keep reading it and keep finding out what happened and also get a glimpse into their family's perspective of the whole entire saga back home as well, then you'll have to get the book. So I have Kidnapped Entanglement paperback is available Amazon, Koorong, and my website, ChristyGraceScarletPen.com. It's also now in ebook form as well at Amazon, and you can read it for free on KDP if you have that. Otherwise, it's really only a couple of bucks. And not only will you be supporting me, but you can also continue the adventure and find out what happens and see where Jazz and Megan and Tony and Aaron all end up and what they end up doing. So I hope that you will enjoy. If you wanted to keep reading it, if you wanted to keep finding out what the story is all about. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching this video. Like, subscribe, and you can follow me on all my socials, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. I'll put all the links below. I am also doing something really exciting and fun. I'm going to give away 2 free copies of my book. 2 free copies! Yay! Okay, so all you have to do... if you wanted to continue the story and you wanted a free version of the paperback format, then all you have to do is go to my Facebook page, Christy Grace author page. Make sure you like that page and then comment in the post, which will be pinned at the top, to do with the competition and say, I want in, and that you want to have a chance at getting the book, and I will be doing a random drawing. Thank you guys so much for watching and for listening, and if you wanted that, don't forget to head to the link below to my author page and you can enter to get a free copy, signed, sealed, delivered, and sent all the way to you. Thank you guys again. I'll see you in the adventures.